Mr. President, you can't just dismiss them all. Traoré didn't even look up. Watch me. Moments later, guards stepped forward. By the time he walked out of that cabinet room, half the ministers were gone. Dismissed, disgraced, and marched out under guard. These weren't just corrupt officials. They were the West's most protected allies inside his own government. And yet, Traoré didn't blink. No warnings, no negotiations, just the sudden fall of men who thought they could never be touched. What happens when a leader dares to break the grip of foreign-backed corruption? Stay with us, because this story moves from abrupt dismissals to shocking, whispered confessions that shook the nation. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. The room was supposed to be routine, a closed-door cabinet meeting on economic policy, the usual coffee, the usual small talk. But this time, nothing was usual at all. The national flag stood taller than ever behind the central seat. 2 guards flanked the entrance, heavily armed, one wearing a face cover, the other scanning every movement in the room with military stillness. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't sit. He stood, palms pressed firmly on the polished table, eyes sweeping across the faces of his own ministers, some loyal, some far less so. Was loyalty in Burkina Faso now a rare currency? "I'm not here to negotiate," he began, his voice calm but laced with something harder than steel. "I'm here to reveal." A thick file dropped onto the table, papers scattered, laptops clicked shut. Every minister stared as a soldier inserted a USB drive into the projection unit. The screen flickered to life. A rebel training camp in the Sahel. Arms, vehicles, crates of rations. Some bearing logos from supposed humanitarian programs. In the background, children with rifles. Adults with satellite phones. On one box, the seal of Burkina Faso's Ministry of Rural Development. Murmurs broke. One minister gasped audibly. President Traoré didn't flinch. This camp received supplies from within this room. Someone shifted in their seat. Another looked down, refusing eye contact. One man, Minister Adama Cabaret, opened his mouth as if to deny something, but no sound came out. Traoré raised a finger. The image zoomed in. A list of transfers appeared on the screen. Money flowing from a private bank in Dakar to an offshore account in Malta. The recipient, a company tied to a cousin of Minister Untitled. For months, we've traced the leaks, the funding, the meetings behind closed doors with Western agents promising stability at the price of our sovereignty. Tell me, what kind of stability comes from selling a nation's soul? The room felt like it had no air. No one moved, not even the guards. Traoré stepped forward. "Let me be clear. Anyone caught assisting these destabilizing forces, whether directly or by silence, will not face exile. You will face justice." Suddenly, a name flashed on screen, redacted, just a black bar. Traoré paused, then turned to his intelligence officer. "Uncover it." Click. The name appeared. Minister Omar Ndiaye, Ministry of Infrastructure. Gasps echoed. Dio stood up, hands trembling. "This is political theatre. You have no right." Traoré cut him off. "I have no need for theatre. I have the receipts." A second image appeared. A Western ambassador and Umar Ndiaye exchanging handshakes outside a compound in Abidjan. Caption underneath, June 3rd, Private Security Funding Agreement. Dio tried to walk out. The masked guard stepped forward and blocked the path. Traoré looked around the room. "This is just the beginning. Resign now, or wait for your name to be called next." A few ministers lowered their heads. One quietly slid a pen toward a blank resignation sheet. The silence was broken only by the sound of the projector powering down. The image of the rebel camp faded into black, but the weight of it stayed. Traoré stepped back and saluted again. This time, not in honor, but in warning. From this day, no minister is above the people, and no traitor is too powerful to fall. As he turned to leave, cameras caught the briefest flicker of emotion on his face. Not anger, but a deep, worn sadness. As if what he was cleaning was not just a government, but a wound carved over generations. And he had just made the first cut. The cabinet chamber hadn't fully recovered. Some ministers still hadn't touched the water glasses in front of them. Others whispered behind half-raised folders, eyes darting to the entrance each time footsteps echoed. But the door remained closed. Then a click, louder than expected, signaled the start of a new recording. A speaker on the table crackled. No introduction, no warning, just voices. A man with a French accent spoke first, calm, measured. You'll have the rights to Zone 8 and 9, but the paperwork must show it was awarded through open bidding. Then, a deeper voice replied. One that every person in the room recognized. It wasn't confirmed, but it didn't need to be. The tone, the rhythm, the arrogance, wasn't it unmistakable? Yes, I understand. The security team will escort the surveyors directly. There will be no local resistance, if the payments are cleared. The recording paused. Traoré stood slowly, arms crossed, letting the silence itself become a form of punishment. Then he spoke. Security aid, they called it. But the deal was clear. They fund rebels, force instability, and in exchange we hand over our minerals disguised as cooperation. No one replied. He walked to the screen, pulled up another document. It was a contract, heavily redacted, but enough was visible. Terms of land access, emergency mining zones, resource extraction rights for 30 years, no local labor, no local revenue. What leader in Burkina Faso would sign such a betrayal? Another line was circled in red, signed pending political stabilization. This, Traoré said, holding up the contract, was not sent to any ministry for review. It was found in the private email of a man in this room, BCC'd to 4 foreign agencies, none of which operate on our soil legally. He looked at Minister Moussa Zoundi. The man flinched, beads of sweat lining his temple. I've never seen this document, Zoundi stammered. Traoré nodded, as if he expected that answer, then turned to the intelligence officer standing by the door. Show him the second tape. This time, the voice on the recording was clearer. Zoundi speaking directly. We can finalize the zones once the riots begin. Traoré will have to divert military resources. It's the perfect window. Gasps broke out. One minister covered her mouth. Another whispered a prayer under his breath. You planned the riots? Someone finally asked. Traoré raised a hand. He didn't plan them. He enabled them. There's a difference. But the law doesn't care. Zoundi collapsed back into his chair, face drained. Traoré turned to the rest. This isn't about just one man, or even 10. This is about a culture that sees foreign applause as more valuable than national dignity. He walked around the table, slow and steady. We weren't elected to be obedient, he said. We were chosen to be honest. And if honesty costs us friends abroad, is that truly a loss? No one dared respond. But their eyes said enough. He pulled out another list, 5 more names. No accusations yet, just names printed in bold, laid flat on the table. The message was clear. One by one, ministers picked up their pens. Some began writing resignations. Others wiped their foreheads, still debating whether to risk exposure or step aside. Traoré walked to the window. Outside, protesters were gathering, but not against him. They held signs with messages like, "Clean the cabinet, and this time we stand with you." He turned back toward the ministers. We don't govern by fear, we govern by faith. Faith that our people will rise, if we stop selling them out. Then he paused, not for effect, but for reflection. For too long we believed the lie that order is peace. But order without justice is just a quieter form of war. He signaled to the guards. Escort Minister Moussa Zoundi. Let the people decide what comes next. The door opened. The soldier stepped forward. Zoundi didn't resist. As he walked past the president, he muttered, "You'll make enemies for this." Traoré replied without looking at him. "I already had them. Now I know their names." The doors shut behind them. A moment later, the projector displayed one final line. Phase 2 to begin after confirmation of delivery. 4 armored trucks already across border. Traoré tapped the table once. Everyone looked up. That confirmation came from a document signed 2 days ago by another minister in this room. He didn't say who, not yet. But every heartbeat in that room waited for it, and the purge had only just begun. The tension inside the cabinet chamber was a living thing now. It pressed against the walls, slipped under the suits of the ministers, and sat like stone in their throats. Traoré hadn't said a word in 10 minutes. He let the silence work harder than shouting ever could. At the far corner of the room, a man stood motionless, fully dressed in tactical combat gear, helmet on, face completely masked, rifle across his chest. He hadn't moved since the beginning of the meeting. His presence was like a warning cast in metal and cloth. No name, no emotion, just discipline. And here's a thought for you. If you were in Traoré's place, would you choose to confront the corrupt no matter the cost or seek compromise? Comment Amen if you trust him. One of the ministers finally asked the question they had all been too afraid to voice. Mr. President, is he part of the Presidential Guard? Traoré didn't even glance at the soldier. He looked directly at the man who asked and said, "No, he's not here to protect me." He stood from his seat, slow and deliberate. "He's here to arrest someone." The words hit like a hammer. One of the ministers dropped his pen, someone else coughed to hide the sudden shake in their voice. Traoré walked to the center of the room, pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table. This is the land title deed for a villa in the Canary Islands, purchased under a shell company. Documents signed by Minister Patrice Ouattara, paid for using a chain of offshore accounts, routed through a project intended for rebuilding roads in our northern provinces. Everyone looked at Minister Patrice Ouattara. The man didn't flinch. He adjusted his collar, glanced around the room, and then stood up, his voice practiced, smug. "This is baseless. That land belongs to my cousin. You can't prove anything." Traoré smiled. But it wasn't with joy, it was with exhaustion. "We already did." He gestured toward the projector. The screen came alive with a photo. A drone shot, date-stamped, clearly showing Ouattara standing in front of the estate with a Spanish real estate agent. Next, scanned email correspondence requesting furniture to be imported from Dubai, then a signature, his signature. "This," Traoré said, tapping the screen, "is your cousin too?" Ouattara's jaw tensed. The development funds for 3 provinces were siphoned off into fake infrastructure budgets. Roads that were never built, schools that were under review. Meanwhile, rebels moved freely through those areas. The masked soldier took one step forward. Just one. Ouattara raised his voice. "This is a setup. You're trying to make me a scapegoat." "No," Traoré said coldly. "I'm showing the nation that corruption has a face, and sometimes it wears a silk tie." He signaled again. The soldier walked across the room, calm, unhurried, rifle at the ready, though never raised. Ouattara stepped back. "You have no right to do this here." Traoré walked closer. "This is not a courtroom. It's not a negotiation. This is the people's house, and the people have waited too long." The soldier stopped beside Ouattara. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ouattara did something no one expected. He laughed. "You think arresting me changes anything? There are more deals, more ministers. You can't clean all of it. The system is too big." Traoré's voice stayed low, steady. "I'm not trying to clean the whole system today. I'm starting with you." He nodded once. The soldier reached forward, took Patrice Ouattara by the arm and secured him with plastic cuffs. No force, no shouting, just finality. As the door opened, Traoré turned to the rest of the ministers. "I want you to watch him leave." They did. Every last one of them. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a man being taken away. It was a symbol, a signal that even power in Burkina Faso had limits. The fall of untouchability, the death of excuses. The door closed behind them. Traoré turned back to the table. 3 ministries are now under audit. 2 more are under surveillance. If your conscience is clear, your seat is safe. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Was there anyone truly certain of their innocence? One by one, ministers began pulling documents from their folders. Some stared at the floor. One quietly wiped his eyes with a cloth and whispered something to himself. The president sat back down, but no one else did, and the man with the mask returned to his post, silent, still, waiting, because his work was far from done. The chamber door hadn't fully shut before a tremor ran through the room. It wasn't from footsteps or voices. It was the sound of fear finally taking root. What had once been whispers behind closed doors was now evidence on a screen and a man in cuffs. No one could pretend anymore. President Traoré remained seated, elbows resting on the dark wood of the cabinet table, fingers laced tightly. His eyes didn't move from the paper in front of him, but the weight of his silence pulled every gaze back toward him. He spoke without lifting his head. "There is a second." Gasps were stifled. All eyes scanned the room, each minister wondering if their time had come. The projector flickered back to life. First came the numbers, wire transfers traced from the National Reconstruction budget into private accounts in the British Virgin Islands. Then came the satellite images, equipment supposedly sent to rebuild the central highway sitting unused in a private storage yard behind a seaside villa. Traoré stood, stepped toward the screen, and clicked to the final slide. A certificate of incorporation from a Western firm. Registered Director, Mamadou Ndiaye, known publicly as a logistics consultant, known privately as the brother of Minister Simon Diallo, head of Public Works and Transportation. No one said his name, but everyone turned to him. Simon Diallo sat frozen, sweat glistening along the ridge of his nose. His lips parted like he might deny it. But the screen changed again. This time, to a recorded phone call. The voice was unmistakable. "I told Mamadou to hide the equipment until we're sure of the next budget round. Then we can write it off as losses and apply for new funds. The World Bank will fill the gap." Simon Diallo stood slowly. His hands trembled as he held up a white document. His letter of resignation. "I resign, effective immediately," he said, his voice shaking. I made mistakes, but Traoré raised a hand. "You don't get to resign after betrayal. You get to answer for it." Diallo's face twisted, panic flooding in. He turned to the exit, hoping, maybe even praying, that no one would move fast enough to stop him. But the masked soldier was already there. With just a step, the path was blocked. The man in uniform didn't raise his weapon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was final. "Step aside," Simon Diallo snapped, desperation slipping into arrogance. "I'm a cabinet minister." Traoré's voice cut through the tension. "You were." That broke whatever illusion remained. The soldier moved in, securing Diallo's wrists with quick precision. The metal cuffs clinked loud and sharp against the room's heavy silence. As Diallo was led away, one minister leaned forward, voice low, just above a whisper. "What happens now?" Traoré answered, without hesitation. "Now we return to what this house was meant to be. A place of service, not status. If we don't clean our house, we have no right to call it ours." He paused. "2 have fallen. The others will be reviewed. Some will walk, some won't." Then he held up another folder. "Each of you is being investigated. Every signature, every transaction, every deal made behind closed doors. There is no amnesty for those who sold pieces of this country to buy themselves comfort." Was there anyone in Burkina Faso's leadership willing to meet that standard? Silence settled like a storm cloud. No more denials, no more laughter. The room was stripped of its confidence. But outside in the streets, the mood was shifting. Crowds had gathered beyond the gates. Protest signs were replaced with flags. Chants for justice rang louder than any speech. For once, they didn't shout against the government. They shouted for it. Traoré turned to the window, his voice softer now. "They never asked us to be perfect. Only to be honest. Only to care more about their children than our portfolios." He looked back at the ministers. "We failed them once. We will not fail them again." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A second soldier stepped in and approached with a sealed envelope. Traoré opened it. Inside, a single printed image. Another satellite photo, another villa, another hidden yard, another name. He didn't show it yet. He simply said, "Tomorrow we continue." And with that, he walked out, leaving the ministers staring at the empty space where their colleague had stood, and now where truth was beginning to take its place. The press room was quiet. Too quiet. For a government briefing that had just been declared urgent. No backdrop slogans, no flags waving, just the weight of the past few days clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. The reporters weren't standing elbow to elbow anymore. They were seated still, watching the podium with wide, cautious eyes. Because they knew the next name was coming. President Traoré stepped forward. Not with his usual composed pace, but with an unmistakable fire behind his eyes. He wasn't there to reassure, he was there to reveal. He placed a single photo on the lectern, a blurry satellite image, nighttime orange flames licking the edge of a village. In the corner, dark clouds of smoke rising from what used to be a rice field. In the center of it all, a ruptured pipeline. There were no rebels in Zinara that night, Traoré said into the microphone. No attack, no sabotage, just corruption. He paused, letting the accusation sink in. Our investigation confirms that the pipeline leak, which burned half of Karuma village, was no accident. The explosion was the result of a deliberate pressure bypass meant to divert fuel to off-grid trucks owned by a foreign transport company. That company, we found, is connected to Minister Haruna Sawadogo. The room tensed. Gasps didn't come from the ministers this time. They came from the journalists. A few flipped through folders, others raised cameras. One woman in the front row pressed her hands to her mouth. Traoré continued. The fuel was being stolen, siphoned off and sold across borders. The funds never touched government accounts, but the losses, they were blamed on rebel sabotage. He stepped back from the mic and pulled out a document. It wasn't typed, it was handwritten, in the local dialect, on notebook paper smudged with dirt and ash. This is a letter from a mother who lost 2 sons in that fire. She wrote, "We screamed for help, but they said the rebels would come back, so they left us to burn." A heavy silence hung in the air. Then a voice broke. "I'm sorry," a young journalist whispered. All heads turned. She stood up slowly, tears already spilling. "My uncle lived there. He was one of the people blamed for storing fuel for rebels. They dragged his name through the dirt. He died trying to save a child from the fire." She couldn't continue. She sank back into her chair, sobbing into her sleeves. Traoré lowered his head. "There are many like your uncle," he said quietly, "and many like the ones who let it happen." Back at the presidential palace, Minister Haruna Sawadogo watched the press conference from a secure room as his name was finally said aloud. His face hardened. Not with surprise, but with realization. The walls were closing in. Sawadogo stood, adjusting his coat as if preparing to walk away from it all. But when he opened the door, 2 guards were already waiting. "You know why we're here," one of them said. He nodded once, as though the fight had drained from him long before this moment. Did he know this day was inevitable? That same evening, Traoré returned to the cabinet chamber. A map was spread out across the table. Red dots marked villages affected by mysterious fuel leaks over the past 3 years. 27 in total. Each one now linked to forged repair contracts signed under Sawadogo's watch. Traoré looked around the room. No more secrets, no more blames passed to phantoms in the forest. From this point forward, every resource belongs to the people, and every lie will be answered with fact. He picked up the same pen Sawadogo had once used to sign false repair authorizations and snapped it in half. "This pen cost lives," he said. "We don't write with silence anymore." That night, across the capital, screens replayed the image of the burning rice field. Villagers watched from porches. Children stared. Elders whispered prayers. And for the first time in years, there were no excuses offered. Just names. Just truth. The next morning, graffiti appeared across one city wall. "We saw the smoke. Now we see the truth." And President Traoré, he wasn't finished. One final folder sat untouched on his desk, thicker than the rest, bound in string, marked only with one word: health. The next name would bring not just anger, but betrayal far deeper than oil ever reached. The cabinet chamber looked nothing like it had a week ago. The grand oak table remained polished to a mirror finish, but the power in the room had shifted. Half the seats were empty, and those who remained sat stiff, hands clasped, eyes down. No coffee cups, no idle chatter, no phones being checked under the table. What could possibly be in this folder that made even the most arrogant keep their gaze low? This wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. President Traoré walked in without ceremony. No guard behind him, no aides at his side, just a slim brown envelope tucked under his arm. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was so deep you could hear the rustle of someone's shirt sleeve as they adjusted their posture. He placed the envelope in the center of the table, untied the string, and pulled out a stack of white paper. Then he spoke. "I have only one question for each of you," he said, voice even but cold. "Are you with this country or with your lifestyle?" No one answered. He passed out the papers one by one. Each sheet was blank except for a line at the bottom and a dotted signature box. "Resignation letters, if you hesitate." He said quietly, "Fill it out." The air turned heavy. One minister, a woman from the Ministry of Tourism, looked up, her voice trembling. "Mr. President, not all of us are guilty." "I agree," Traoré said, without hesitation. "And that's exactly why this is necessary. The innocent need to rise, but the undecided, they need to go." Another minister shifted uncomfortably, a man who had once held 3 posts under 3 different presidents. He cleared his throat, tried to speak, but the words never left his mouth. Instead, he reached for the pen beside him and stared at the resignation form like it was a confession booth. Traoré didn't pressure him. He simply stood still, letting the weight of integrity fill the silence. "This table used to be a place of strategy," he continued, "but over the years, it became a place of survival. You calculated your loyalty based on who funded your next project, not who fed your people." He walked slowly around the room. "I watched as schools remained unfinished while consultants took luxury trips to Geneva. I watched clinics receive expired medicine because someone earned a bonus from a ghost supplier. I kept a list, not because I wanted to punish you, but because I wanted to believe you'd fix it yourselves. Tell me, why did you never try?" He stopped behind the chair of the Minister of Commerce, whose face had turned pale. "You never did," he said. A small creak sounded as the minister stood. He picked up the paper, signed it without a word, and placed it back on the table. One down. The Minister of Information followed, then the Deputy Minister of Education. One after another, the papers slid forward. Some signatures smooth, others shaking. But all of them knew they weren't being fired. They were being given a final chance to walk away with dignity before the people took it from them. Traoré collected the signed pages without comment. When he reached the end of the table, only 6 ministers remained seated with their papers blank. He looked at them not as a group, but one by one. "If your conscience is clean, stay. But if there is a part of you that still negotiates with your shame, walk out now, because I will not be merciful later." The doors opened. 3 ministers stood and left. 3 remained. One of them, an old man who had served since the early independence days, looked at Traoré and whispered, "I was waiting for someone like you. I thought I'd die before I saw it." Traoré nodded once. "You were never the problem," he said, "but now I need you to be part of the solution." He sat back down at the head of the table. No applause greeted him. No praise. Just silence, thick with responsibility. "This cabinet is now provisional," he said. "The public will know by nightfall who stayed and who stepped down. We are not hiding names. We are not hiding truths." Outside the chamber, news already began to spread. Reporters filmed stacks of resignation papers carried in sealed boxes. Citizens gathered at government buildings, not to protest but to watch, to witness something rare: accountability. That evening, across the country, television anchors didn't read headlines. They read names. And in one quiet village where a school had once stood unfinished, an old woman turned to her grandson and said, "The wind has changed." She wasn't wrong, because the next meeting wouldn't be about punishment. It would be about rebuilding. And the man who would lead that was already preparing the next list, not of resignations, but of replacements. The press had just begun to settle after the cabinet resignations when a new controversy erupted across every screen in Burkina Faso. This time, it wasn't a minister under fire. It was a general. General Souleymane Kafando, veteran of 3 wars, decorated with medals across his chest, like a walking museum of national defense. He had served 4 presidents and commanded thousands. He was known as a man who never bent. Until now. In a televised interview aired by a Western-backed channel, the general broke his silence. The Minister of Energy, Haruna Sawadogo, served this nation with dignity, he said, eyes steady. We are entering dangerous waters when our loyalty is judged by headlines, not by history. The quote was clipped, magnified, and spun by foreign media. They called it courage. They called it a military check on civilian power. But in the capital, people read between the lines. Traoré didn't respond on camera, didn't argue, didn't tweet. He picked up the phone. The next morning, General Kafando received a handwritten summons. By afternoon, he was in the palace. The meeting wasn't in the war room. It wasn't in the presidential office. It was in a plain, windowless chamber used for storage. 2 chairs, a single table, a small audio recorder placed between them. No cameras, no advisors, no press. Traoré sat down first. You came, he said calmly. Kafando stood stiffly, arms behind his back. I respect the institution, even when I question the man leading it. Then sit, Traoré replied. Let's talk like men who claim to love the same country. The recorder clicked on. The full conversation was never released. What was said in that room would remain sealed. But what could have been exchanged in just 47 minutes that could turn a veteran's stance completely? What happened after would be remembered forever. 47 minutes later, the door opened. The general emerged alone. His medals were still on his chest, but something in his expression had shifted. His jaw was softer, his stride slower. He didn't speak to the waiting journalists. He walked straight to the podium outside and removed a folded piece of paper from his jacket. My service has been long, he said, and not without mistakes. I fought battles abroad and at home, but I realize now the most dangerous war is the one fought inside your own loyalty. He unfolded the paper. My resignation is effective immediately. Gasps echoed through the crowd. But he wasn't done. He turned toward the building, faced the presidential window, and raised his hand in salute. I forgot what side I was on, he said. Now I remember. Then he walked away. No security escorted him. No applause followed him. Just silence. Deep. Respectful. Inside the palace, Traoré stood at the window, watching the general disappear down the long stone path. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just whispered, one more honest man reclaimed. That night, whispers turned into headlines, not about scandal, but about transformation. A soldier who had once threatened a coup now offered his surrender, not in defeat, but in reflection. Militaries across West Africa played the clip in classrooms. In one school near Bobo Dioulasso, a teenage cadet raised his hand. Was he weak for giving up? The instructor paused, then replied, no, he was strong for knowing when to stop holding a sword and start holding himself accountable. The next morning, General Kafando's uniform was placed in a glass case at the National Military Museum. Beneath it, a plaque read, "A warrior once for the country, a citizen always after truth." Traoré returned to his schedule without fanfare, no speeches, no celebrations. But he made one quiet phone call to a rural colonel whose unit had been overlooked for years. That colonel received orders to report to the capital because the vacant seat left by General Souleymane Kafando wouldn't stay empty for long. And this time, it wouldn't go to someone who had merely survived wars. It would go to someone who had survived corruption without ever joining in. Wasn't that the rarer kind of courage? The balance of power had shifted again, not with gunfire, but with conscience. And the country kept watching, because if even a general could admit he had forgotten the side he served, then perhaps the nation hadn't been lost after all. It had just been waiting for men to remember. The deeper they dug, the less they found, on paper at least. Burkina Faso's national audit team had spent weeks tracing unusual land lease patterns in the eastern border zones. Fields once used for local farming had suddenly fallen under foreign contracts. Villagers had been told the land was being repurposed for sustainable agriculture programs. But there were no tractors, no harvest, just guards and silence. Then came the name, Ventura AG, registered in Zurich. No office, no staff photos, no website. Just a name and a postbox address. And somehow, Ventura AG held legal rights to over 14,000 hectares of land inside what used to be conflict zones, now controlled by government forces. President Traoré sat at the head of the intelligence debriefing room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the map pinned to the wall. "Who signed the leases?" he asked. The lead investigator flipped open the file. Each one carries the signature of Amadou Ouedraogo. Traoré's face darkened. Ouedraogo, former Minister of Agriculture, once hailed as the man who launched the country's food security initiative, had disappeared 2 months after the cabinet purge began. His resignation had arrived by courier. No speech, no explanation, no forwarding address. Where is he now? The investigator laid out a series of flight records tracing Ouedraogo's departure from Ouagadougou to Casablanca, then quietly into Lisbon. From there he vanished, but the paper trail hadn't. One contract in particular raised alarms. It transferred grazing lands in the Sahel to a foreign investment partner under a 50-year lease, renewable without national oversight. The deal had been signed 2 days before Ouedraogo's resignation, and was backdated to avoid review by the new audit team. The signature was there, clean, confident, final. But it wasn't just a betrayal of policy, it was a betrayal of people. One of the stolen regions included land that had been promised to displaced farmers returning after years of conflict. Families had already started rebuilding homes. Children had begun planting again. Now those same lands were being patrolled by foreign security teams in unmarked vehicles. Traoré stood up. "Call Interpol," he said. "Issue a red notice." The announcement went public within the hour. National TV broadcast Amadou Ouedraogo's photo across the country, beneath it the words, "Wanted for crimes against sovereignty." The public response was swift. In Ouedraogo's hometown, someone spray-painted a message on the wall of the old agricultural office. "We grew the food, he sold the land." Traoré held a press briefing that evening. No teleprompter, no prepared remarks. "We do not chase ghosts," he began. "We chase signatures. Documents do not lie, and the paper trail left by Mr. Ouedraogo is one of betrayal. Long, calculated, and dangerous." He held up the original lease, stamped and notarized in a European capital. "This document gave foreign hands control of the land your children were meant to inherit. This company, Ventura AG, has no face, no history, and no purpose, except to profit off the pain we buried." The journalists remained still. There were no questions. Just the sound of truth cutting deeper than any headline could. Outside the city, the situation grew more volatile. Villagers confronted the foreign security personnel now occupying their land. Some waved flags, others held handwritten signs, "This is not yours." In one case, a standoff lasted 3 hours. No weapons were used, just voices. A village elder stood his ground and said, "My father died on this soil. You won't take it with ink." Wasn't that a sharper weapon than any rifle? Back in the capital, international phone lines buzzed with discomfort. Embassies requested clarity on the Interpol move. Western legal firms threatened litigation. One ambassador called it a misunderstanding of global investment strategy. Traoré replied through a simple televised message. "Burkina Faso does not misunderstand. Burkina remembers." Meanwhile, intelligence agents uncovered more layers. Ventura AG was linked to 2 other shell companies, both of which had funneled money back to a regional non-profit chaired by Ouedraogo's nephew. What looked like aid was, in fact, profit. And it wasn't just about land. One contract included mineral rights buried beneath it. The theft wasn't only above ground, it was deep, silent, calculated. A robbery that didn't need a weapon, just a stamp. But now the trail had been lit, and the man who thought he'd escaped into exile found his name becoming a symbol for something he never expected: justice. Because in the heart of Burkina Faso, a new law was already being drafted, one that declared all land leases made during conflict years subject to public referendum. No more hidden deals, no more faceless companies, and no more ministers who thought disappearing could erase the damage. Ouedraogo's time was running out, and the next signature Traoré planned to collect wasn't on a contract. It was on a confession. The envelope arrived without a name, no title, no official markings, just a brown paper wrap and a return address from a village no one in the capital talked about. Como, near the southern border, where cell signals drop and paved roads end. It was addressed directly to President Traoré's office. Inside the envelope was a plastic bag filled with uncooked rice and a folded receipt printed on fading thermal paper. Traoré sat in his office staring at it under the desk lamp. The rice was standard humanitarian grade, marked with an International Relief Organization symbol. The receipt, however, told a different story. It showed the rice had been sold at a local market for 28 times its original value. The item description: imported premium rice. Private stock. The vendor, a pop-up stand registered under the name of a company with no tax history. A ghost business. But the receipt carried a small detail that changed everything. At the bottom was a batch code that matched recent UN shipments distributed through the Ministry of Social Development. He didn't wait for a full report. Within an hour, Traoré summoned the Minister of Social Development, Aissata Traoré Bah, to the palace. She walked in confidently, wearing a tailored suit and a practiced smile. She had survived 3 administrations, known for her polished speeches about dignity and equality. But today, there were no cameras, no podium. Just the bag of rice on the table and a single question. "Do you recognize this?" Traoré asked. She blinked once, then twice. "It looks like one of the food aid packages, probably redistributed through village councils." He slid the receipt across the table. It wasn't redistributed, it was sold. And here's something for you to ponder. If you were in Traoré's place, would you expose a leader you once trusted to protect the continent's future? Comment Africa Rise if you believe in Africa's strength. Traoré Bah's smile faltered. "Sir, I can assure you our department monitors all local deliveries. If someone exploited the chain, we will—" "You are the chain," Traoré cut in. "And this receipt has your department's supply number printed in the footer." He stood, holding the bag in one hand and the receipt in the other. "Do you know how many children eat once a day in Como? Do you know that this bag was supposed to be free? Instead, a family paid 2 weeks' wages for it. And that merchant didn't buy it from the black market. He bought it from a registered distributor linked to your procurement officer." The silence stretched. Then she said quietly, "This isn't my doing. I never signed off on anything like this." "You didn't have to," he replied. "But you benefited from it." Documents had already been reviewed. Her personal driver had received over $12,000 in unexplained wire transfers from third-party food vendors. Those vendors were traced to inflated purchase orders from her department. She never signed the sales directly. But she didn't stop them either. And that made her guilty. Outside, the press hadn't been alerted. This wasn't for headlines, this was for justice. "You can either resign today and open your accounts to the audit committee," Trey said, "or I can hold a public hearing and let the mothers of Como ask their questions themselves." Traoré Bah's face turned pale. "I built this ministry," she said, voice trembling. "You don't understand the pressure, the quotas, the partnerships we have to manage to keep aid flowing." Traoré stared her down. "No partnership justifies starving your own." She sat back in the chair, the weight of it all finally landing. Slowly, she pulled a pen from her bag and wrote a resignation on palace stationery. Before leaving, she asked, "Will the people believe I was ever trying to help?" Traoré didn't answer, because it wasn't about belief anymore. It was about evidence. That evening, a national broadcast showed the rice bag, the receipt, and a statement from the president. Injustice wears many faces. Today it wore a smile and a scarf. It will wear shame tomorrow. The villagers of Como gathered around battery-powered radios. A merchant stood among them, holding a copy of the receipt he'd mailed weeks ago. His hands shook, not because he was afraid, but because someone had finally listened. In a land where corruption once seemed too high to touch, a single grain of rice had brought down an empire of theft. In the capital, an emergency audit of all food distribution programs began, and Traoré prepared for what came next, because if rice was for sale, so was medicine. And the people who sold both would answer one by one. The envelope was blue, wrinkled at the corners, and sealed with nothing but tape. It was delivered to the palace gate by a quiet teenage girl in school uniform, her hair tied in a rushed bun, her shoes dusty from the long walk. She didn't ask to meet the president, she only said, "Please give this to someone who still cares." The guard took it, expecting a letter of protest or a request for tuition support, but inside was something different. A small red diary, hand-stitched, filled with lined pages in delicate handwriting. At the top of the first page, confidential. Do not ignore me this time. It belonged to Mariam Ouedraogo, 17 years old, recent high school graduate, and intern at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She was assigned as a clerical assistant to one of the deputy ministers, a man known more for his ties abroad than his work at home. For months, Mariam had sat quietly in hallways, carried coffee, arranged folders. No one paid her attention, but she was always listening. And what she heard, she wrote in her diary. Details that didn't appear in any official report. Late-night meetings with foreign businessmen who entered through side doors, briefcases exchanged without logs, cars with diplomatic plates arriving after curfew. She listed dates, license plates, overheard code names. She even sketched the faces of men she wasn't allowed to speak to. But it was one entry that shook the president's inner circle. March 14th, 11:37 p.m. I saw him give the man a small silver USB. I was told to leave, but I doubled back through the stairwell. I heard him say, "This has the names. If anything happens to me, it'll all be released. Our friends in Brussels know the deal." The next page was smeared, as if written in haste or with shaking hands. I thought I'd be helping my country. I didn't know I'd be watching it get sold. President Traoré read the diary 3 times before speaking. "Find her," he said. His security team tracked her down at a school in the outskirts of Ouagadougou. She was in a classroom cleaning chalkboards when she saw them. She didn't run, she simply said, "I was wondering when someone would read it." They brought her to the palace. Not as a suspect, but as a witness. Traoré met with her personally. No guards, no press, just the 2 of them and the diary on the table. "I'm not trying to be a hero," Mariam said. "I just didn't want to become one of them." "Tell me what you heard about the USB," he asked. She nodded. "They said it had lists of contractors and encrypted payments, foreign funds routed through ministries, but also a folder called Internal Management. I think it meant names of people on our side, the ones helping. Do you know where it is now?" "I saw him put it in his jacket. The next day he flew to Geneva." The deputy minister was already on Traoré's radar, but this was the link they needed. A direct act of espionage using government infrastructure to smuggle sensitive data out of the country. Was this the first time, or just the first time they caught him? That night, a quiet international notice was sent. Not loud like Interpol's red notice, but silent and surgical, moving through diplomatic backchannels. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, desks were swept, offices searched. A second intern came forward anonymously, confirming the same story. By dawn, the deputy minister's office was sealed. President Traoré stood before his cabinet later that morning, the red diary in his hand. She was 17, no security clearance, no rank, no power. And yet she saw what none of you dared report. He looked around the room, pausing on each face. Ask yourselves why. The ministers remained silent. Then he turned to his national ethics chief. Create a new witness protection program. Anyone who steps forward with evidence of corruption, no matter how small, will be protected. We're done punishing courage. The red diary was scanned, archived, and stored in the new Office of Internal Integrity, but the original stayed on his desk. That afternoon, Mariam Ouedraogo received a scholarship from the government. She asked for only one thing in return: no photo ops, no interviews. "I just want to go to school, and I want someone honest to keep watching when I'm not there." In the village where her mother lived, neighbors gathered around the radio, tears running down their faces as the story was told. A girl who watched too much, a system that said nothing for too long, and a president who finally listened. But in Geneva, the man with the USB drive was already making moves. Because what that USB contained wasn't just lists, it was leverage. And Traoré's fight was about to go global. The summit hall in Brussels was a masterpiece of quiet power. Glass walls, leather chairs, and diplomats who spoke in polished half-truths. Flags of donor nations stood neatly in a row behind the long table, each one whispering influence without needing to shout. President Traoré stepped into the room wearing a simple, tailored suit. No entourage, no flash. They had asked him to come alone. Across the table sat men in grey suits and practiced smiles, each representing governments and banks with stakes in Africa's minerals, ports, and future. They had been watching Traoré closely ever since his purge began, arresting ministers, seizing land, cancelling deals. Too bold, too fast, too loud. Now they wanted to tame him with gold. "We recognize the structural reforms your administration has made," one diplomat began, sliding a polished folder across the table. "This is a development support package, 3.7 billion euros over 4 years. Traoré didn't touch it. Another leaned in. "The terms are generous. No interest for 10 years. Direct grants for infrastructure, education, even digital connectivity." He opened the folder. Inside were charts, figures, and a breakdown of support allocations. On the final page, buried in vague language, was a condition: suspension of pending investigations and regulatory freezes on existing multinational contracts. It was phrased diplomatically, but the message was clear: stop the arrests, protect their people. In exchange, Burkina Faso would be made whole. Traoré closed the folder slowly. The men across the table smiled, expecting thanks. Instead, he stood. "We don't trade dignity for development," he said. The smiles disappeared. "I was not sent here to make your investments comfortable. I was sent here because my people were robbed in silence while you applauded our stability." "Mr. President," one of them said carefully, "this support could change your nation's entire economic trajectory." "No," Traoré replied. "This support would change who we answer to." He pushed the folder back. "We are building roads with our own labor now, schools with our own taxes. You think I fear poverty, but I fear something worse, being remembered as the man who sold integrity for comfort." The room chilled. Another diplomat tried a softer tone. "There are leaders before you who accepted similar offers. They left legacies of growth." "They left ruins wrapped in statistics," Traoré said. "Their people still walk barefoot on roads built to export raw ore. We are not the same." The conversation ended there. No deals, no signatures. As he exited the building, reporters swarmed, expecting headlines of cooperation. Instead, Traoré gave them a single sentence: "Burkina Faso will grow, but it will grow clean." The media spun into overdrive. Some called him a hero, others said he was reckless. Investment analysts predicted economic isolation. But in Ouagadougou, something else was happening. Wasn't this the first time in years the people saw leadership choose pride over payment? Shopkeepers hung his quote on paper signs in their windows. Students painted it on school walls. In a farming village that had waited 5 years for a promised water tank from a Western NGO, a boy wrote the words in chalk on his classroom door: "We don't trade dignity for development." That night, in a private dinner with his closest advisors, Traoré remained calm. "They will come back," he said, "with new offers, more polished lies. But we will be ready, because now they know our answer." Back in Brussels, one of the negotiators made a phone call. He sounded tired. He turned it down. All of it. Just like that. On the other end, a voice replied, "Then the next phase begins. If we can't buy him, we isolate him." And that was the moment the game changed. This wasn't about contracts anymore. It was about sovereignty. The following day, Burkina Faso's finance ministry received notices from 3 international ratings agencies quietly downgrading their credit outlook. A major French company suspended its solar investment project. A logistics partner delayed shipment of essential materials, citing new compliance concerns. The pressure had begun. But Traoré didn't flinch. He gathered his team and ordered a complete review of all foreign contracts. Every clause, every backdoor, every dollar. If they want to test how far we'll go, he said, then let's show them. Across the region, other nations watched closely. Presidents, ministers, even journalists. They whispered to one another, some in admiration, some in fear, because Traoré had done what few dared. He walked away from billions, and the world now had to decide whether to punish him or follow. The envelope arrived with dirt on its edges. It wasn't typed, it wasn't sealed in wax, it was folded cloth tied with string, hand-delivered by a barefoot boy who had ridden the back of a grain truck for 3 days. Inside was a letter. No signature, no official letterhead, just graphite pencil on coarse brown paper. It read, "Mr. President, we no longer dig for them, we dig for us now." The words came from the miners of Seguaga, a remote, gold-rich province, long overlooked and long exploited. For decades, international companies had operated there with full control, extracting minerals while the villages nearby remained in poverty. Roads were broken, schools had no desks, families saw trucks pass by carrying wealth they would never touch. Until now. After Traoré's purge of corrupt ministries and rejection of foreign contracts, something shifted in the provinces. The foreign mining company in Segwe quietly shut down its operations and left, expecting the site to collapse without them. But it didn't. The miners stayed. They formed a cooperative. No hierarchy, no consultants. Just old tools, shared food, and a ledger. They created their own accountability system. Each ounce of gold was weighed in public. Each coin earned was split across needs. Schools, medicine, savings. Wasn't this, in its purest form, the kind of governance the capital had failed to deliver for decades? They brought in engineers from a technical school Traoré had reopened. Not foreigners, but Burkinab youth trained in geology and safety. No one got rich, but no one was hungry. Attached to the letter were handwritten ledgers showing their first 3 months of operations. Revenues were up, waste was down, morale was higher than ever recorded under foreign management. They had even begun planting trees around the site, something contractors never did. At the bottom of the page, one final sentence. "We finally see gold and don't feel shame." President Traoré read the letter in silence, standing by the office window as the sun rose over the capital. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned to his economic advisor. "Send them what they need. Machinery, boots, fuel. But no executives, no foreign observers, no one to tell them how to be free." The next day, a camera crew was dispatched to Shinaga. Not for a press stunt, but to document a story no one believed was real. What they captured was startling. Miners laughing as they worked. Women counting coins with weathered hands. A blackboard outside the mine showing profits and local spending goals. One teenage boy explained the accounting system better than most bankers in the capital. "It's not about gold," he said. "It's about dignity." The footage aired on national television during prime time. There were no edits, no background music, just raw truth. Across Burkina Faso, something lit up. In Guyeri, farmers started a grain cooperative. In Venora, teachers began repairing classrooms with pooled funds. In the north, a group of widows launched a textile circle using old relief supplies. The spark was real. Back in the capital, Traoré called a cabinet meeting. Not in the palace, but under a tree in a public square. He held up the letter from the mine and read it aloud. "Leadership doesn't always start in this room," he said. "Sometimes it starts 300 miles away with a pickaxe and a promise." Then he handed out blank notepads. "Write down one thing you will give up to make room for these people to lead. Not policies, sacrifices." One by one, ministers wrote. Some pledged to cut salaries, others volunteered to close travel budgets. A few quietly committed to stepping down from overlapping board positions. No one clapped, no one smiled, but no one looked away. Later that week, a new ministry was formed. Not for control, but support. The Ministry of Community Enterprise. Its first office, Shanga. Its first hire, a miner with no degree, but eyes that had seen how exploitation ends. The world media didn't know what to make of it. One Western outlet called it rural populism. Another dismissed it as unsustainable romanticism. But inside Burkina Faso, no one cared what the world thought anymore. They had a new currency now, not gold, not aid, but trust. And it had taken one mine, one village, and one letter to remind them where real power lives. In the hands that dig, in the voices that write, and in the courage to say, we don't work for them anymore. We work for each other. The cabinet table looked nothing like it did when Traoré first sat at its head. Once full of polished shoes, loud voices, and hidden agendas, it now held silence and space. Most of the seats were empty. Those who remained worked late, arrived early, and answered questions with open files, not excuses. Except for one, Minister Mahamadou Compaoré, Minister of Finance. 3 decades in government, fluent in 5 languages, educated abroad, untouched by scandal, unmoved by pressure. The last man who had not stepped down, not apologized, not even blinked. Traoré had waited, knowing the final stone takes the longest to fall. But Compaoré didn't crack. He walked the halls in tailored suits and calm nods, holding his head higher as others fell around him. "You're wasting your energy, Mr. President," Compaoré said one morning as they met in the palace library. "You think you're building something new, but ideals don't fill budgets. You can't run a country with moral victories." Traoré stood across from him, hands behind his back. "You can't serve a nation with debt in your heart." Compaoré chuckled. "You think these people need truth? They need electricity, jobs, money in their pockets. No one eats dignity. Tell that to the children working the mines, while your investors ship out profits," Traoré said. Compaoré's expression didn't change. "You're emotional. That's not leadership. That's theatre." But Traoré wasn't arguing for effect. He was waiting, because he already knew. The final audit had landed on his desk the night before. It was thicker than any report so far. Inside were bank records, offshore accounts, property deeds, and confidential memos leaked by a whistleblower in Brussels. Wasn't it always the quiet ones who built the largest shadows? Compaoré didn't just manage national debt, he profited from it. The report showed a web of shell companies registered in the Caribbean, Dubai, and Luxembourg, dozens of luxury apartments across Europe, a private vineyard in Portugal, even a yacht under a cousin's name. The holdings were vast, discreet, and impossible to justify on a public salary. Worst of all, several of the companies were linked to contracts with international lenders Compaoré had personally signed off on. Interest rates that crippled village projects, then rerouted kickbacks into private accounts. He wasn't just stealing, he was selling national futures to finance personal comfort. Traoré didn't call a press conference. He called a classroom at the University of Ouagadougou. Students were invited to an open lecture on transparency. Cameras rolled, faculty filled the back rows. No one knew what was coming. Traoré stepped to the front and placed 2 items on the podium, a calculator and a folder. "This," he said, holding the calculator, "is what we told the people we used." Then he raised the folder. "This is what we actually used." The pages were projected on the screen behind him, one by one. Property deeds in French and Portuguese, receipts, airline bookings for luxury tours, a purchase order for marble flown into an apartment in Milan. Each slide had Mahamadou Compaoré's signature, each one a betrayal. The students didn't gasp, they got angry. A law student stood up and shouted, "We couldn't afford clean water. My mother sold firewood to buy bottled water because of budget cuts." Another added, "He taxed bread but bought a 3rd villa." The room filled with voices. Not wild, not chaotic, but focused, fierce, alive. Wasn't this the sound of a generation refusing to inherit the rot? Back at the ministry, Compaoré was watching the live stream. He didn't slam his fist, he didn't panic. He adjusted his tie and whispered, "Finally." Then he walked to his office window, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope marked personal. Inside was a resignation letter. Already dated, already signed. Later that afternoon, he arrived at the palace. No guards, no staff, no excuses. He placed the envelope on Traoré's desk. "I knew it would end like this." "No," Traoré said. "You thought it never would." Compaoré didn't reply. He simply turned, walked out of the office, and disappeared into history. No applause, no farewell ceremony, just a quiet end to a long game. That evening, a new law was introduced in Parliament, the Public Holdings Transparency Act. Every public official would be required to declare international assets. Failure to comply would mean permanent disqualification from public service. The next day, the same classroom hosted a new guest lecturer. It wasn't a politician. It was the student who had shouted about her mother's bottled water. Her topic, how to serve the nation without selling it. And so the last minister fell, not with noise, but with proof. There were no journalists outside the courthouse, no lights, no microphones, no live coverage on national television. This trial wasn't meant for the world. It was meant for the country's soul. The courtroom itself was plain. No marble floors, no flags behind the bench. Just 4 wooden benches, a dusty ceiling fan, and a judge who had spent most of his life in the countryside. He didn't wear robes, just a clean white shirt and a voice that cut through silence. President Traoré had ordered it this way. No spectacle, he said. Justice. The defendants were seated in a row. Former ministers, officials, aides, and one ex-general, all once powerful, now silent. Their hands didn't wear cuffs, but their names no longer held armor. The charges were read calmly: misuse of public funds, collusion with foreign actors, land fraud, humanitarian theft. Each case was backed by documents. Not accusations, but facts. The first witness was a government accountant. He testified to falsified budgets and backdated signatures. He brought files, emails, receipts. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. The second was a nurse from the northern province. Her clinic had been on the list for medical aid 3 years in a row, but nothing ever arrived. Her voice cracked as she said, "We buried a newborn in a shoebox. There was no medicine, just pain." She held up a delivery invoice, signed by a man sitting in the second row. He lowered his head, but it was the third witness who changed everything. A teenage boy stepped forward, barely 16, his uniform stiff at the shoulders, jaw clenched so tight it seemed carved from stone. The judge asked him to state his name. He did, and then he added, "And the man sitting there is my father." Gasps were held. No one moved. "My father taught me to love this country," the boy said, "to respect the land, to believe in honesty." Then he pulled out a document, an internal memo from the Ministry of Agriculture, proving that farmland had been leased to a foreign shell company under false environmental exemptions. "My father signed this," he said. "He told me it would help us build, but I know now he sold our soil." The courtroom held its breath. The father's face didn't move at first. Then slowly, his eyes filled. He didn't speak, didn't deny. He just cried. Not for being caught, but for being seen. Seen by the one person who had believed in him the most. The judge asked if the boy wanted to withdraw. "No," he said. "If truth is the only inheritance we have left, I want to leave it behind." And wasn't that, in its quiet way, the most dangerous sentence in the room? More witnesses came forward. A former driver described suitcases of cash being delivered during late-night meetings. A retired secretary testified about shredded memos and whispered orders. A village elder explained how rebel zones were created not by militants but by silence and greed. No one shouted, no one protested, because there were no cameras. And without an audience, truth had no stage to perform on, only a floor to stand upon. When it came time for sentencing, the judge didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of restoration. "You were not sentenced by rage," he said. "You were sentenced by paper, by signatures, by patterns. You will not be buried by history. You will be named in it." Some were sentenced to prison, others to restitution and public service. One was stripped of his assets and assigned to labor rebuilding schools in the region he once ignored. Traoré watched from a separate room. He didn't sit in the chamber. He didn't need to. He had already made the choice not to interfere. Let the law speak now. After the verdicts, a plain white sheet was posted outside the courthouse, listing the names and sentences. No titles, just names. Underneath, one line: "The country remembers." That night there was no parade, but across the nation, people lit candles. Not to celebrate punishment, but to honor accountability. In marketplaces, elders nodded. In homes, children ask questions. In one village, a teacher said, "Today justice came quietly, but it stayed long enough to matter." The next morning, a journalist posted a photo of the empty press stands outside the courtroom. Her caption read, "No cameras, no applause." But the country watched anyway. In a world used to loud moments, this one was different. It was silent, it was firm, it was the sound of a nation beginning to rebuild itself, not through outrage alone, but through courage and deliberate honesty. And in that quiet, something began to heal. They gathered in the old town hall, not in marble chambers or glittering government buildings, but in a converted civic center with faded walls and wooden benches. No uniforms, no microphones, just a simple podium and folding chairs arranged in a circle. President Traoré stood at the center, not behind the podium but among them. Around him sat a group no one ever expected to see in the spotlight. Former drivers, janitors, assistants, clerks. The quiet backbone of the ministries that had collapsed. They were the ones who had stayed after their bosses had fled or been arrested. They weren't accused, but they weren't spotless either. They were witnesses, and some, by their own admission, had been complicit. "I want to hear your stories," Trey said, voice low but steady. "Not to shame you, but to understand how corruption survived for so long without being shouted down." At first, no one spoke. Then a woman in a mustard-colored dress stood. She was a former receptionist at the Minister of Energy's office. "I used to reorder the bottled water 3 times a week, not because we needed it, but because someone was skimming the overages," she said. "I signed for it, I knew something was off. But every time I thought about saying something, I remembered I had a child to feed." She sat down quickly. Another voice followed. An older man, quiet and careful. "I was a janitor at the Ministry of Social Development," he said. "I emptied trash cans every night. I saw torn invoices, burned receipts. I knew. I just didn't think anyone would ever care enough to ask." Then came the driver. He had served 3 different ministers over a decade. They talked openly in the back seat, like I didn't exist. One even handed me an envelope once and said, "Hold this, it's from our French partners." I held it. I didn't open it, but I knew. Still, I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my job. He looked down at his hands. It should have been. Traoré didn't interrupt. He let them speak. Some told of fear, some of survival. Others simply admitted they didn't think speaking up would change anything. That, he said, was the greatest crime corruption ever committed. Not the theft of money, but the murder of belief. For a system to rot, it doesn't need monsters. It just needs silence. He turned to the group. "But the fact that you're here means you broke that silence." He opened a folder and read a list of names, not of people on trial, but of those who had come forward voluntarily. The list included 2 secretaries, a former procurement officer, and a mid-level accountant who had turned over USB drives after seeing the trial of his former boss. "You didn't run," Traoré said. "You didn't hide. You stayed." From the back, a young woman raised her hand. She had worked as a tea vendor inside the Minister of Commerce's office. "I brought tea into meetings where I saw briefcases slide under tables," she said. "One day I wrote down a license plate. I didn't know where to send it, but I still have the paper." She pulled it from her pocket. Traoré took it, unfolded it gently, and read the number aloud. A man in the room inhaled sharply. It matched the plate of a logistics contractor who had been arrested just weeks earlier. Proof once ignored was now remembered. In that room, the line between witness and whistleblower began to blur. What started as testimony slowly turned into confession, and what began as guilt began to evolve into accountability. By the end of the hearing, a list of 47 people had added their names to the Citizens of Conscience Registry, a voluntary database for those who had served within broken institutions but were ready to help rebuild them. They wouldn't be called heroes. They would be watchmen. Traoré handed out 1-page documents titled Commitment to Transparency. Each person signed their name, not as absolution, but as a beginning. That night, national radio aired a short segment about the hearing. No dramatic music, no shouting accusations, just the voice of the janitor saying one quiet line, "I knew, I just didn't think anyone would ever care enough to ask." And the voice of Traoré responding, "We're asking now." In a country once silenced by fear, people were speaking again, not just those in power, but those who wiped the floors beneath it. And somewhere in the distance, in an office being rebuilt from dust, a new sign was nailed to the wall. It read, "Truth starts with the people who stayed." The next scene was far from that humble room. The hall was lit with crystal chandeliers, polished brass nameplates, and carefully choreographed smiles. Flags lined the stage in a perfect arc. Interpreters sat in glass booths, and delegates from across West Africa entered one by one in tailored suits, escorted by assistants carrying binders and briefcases. Cameras rolled from the moment the doors opened. The 38th West African Development and Economic Cooperation Summit was underway. All the expected faces were there. Ministers from coastal nations, security chiefs, governors of regional banks. The French delegation arrived early, speaking in quiet tones with their preferred allies. Everyone noticed the chair near the front labeled Burkina Faso. It was empty. Not by mistake, not due to delay, but by design. The murmurs began even before the first opening speech. Where was Traoré? Would he arrive late as a statement? Was this a symbolic protest or something more dangerous? A high-ranking diplomat from Côte d'Ivoire leaned toward a delegate from Senegal and whispered, "He wouldn't miss this unless he wanted us to feel it." Then the moderator stepped forward. "We begin today's proceedings with an acknowledgement from Burkina Faso." An aide approached the empty seat, unfolded a sheet of paper, and read aloud, "We thank you for the invitation. We respectfully decline to attend. We will join this room when it is ready to speak truth, not just speak French." And President Ibrahim Traoré. Gasps followed, then silence. Some squirmed, some rolled their eyes, but none could ignore the message. Traoré's words struck deeper than absence. They spoke to the heart of every agreement made behind closed doors. They challenged the summit's language, not just in words, but in posture. How the room was designed, how business was done, how power moved. No French translator spoke next. None was needed. Everyone understood. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat with farmers in a circle beneath a baobab tree. No cameras, no podiums, just hands in soil and conversations about irrigation. When an advisor informed him of the reaction in the summit hall, he only nodded. They were used to seats being filled, not questioned. In his absence, the summit limped forward. A proposed resolution on transnational infrastructure failed to gain unanimous support. A clause granting foreign contractors preferred access to post-conflict zones was struck down by two newer members. Private murmurs from Guinea and Mali signaled possible alignment with Burkina Faso's stance. Even the press noted a tone shift. But it wasn't just politics. It was about presence. The chair with the Burkina Faso nameplate became the most photographed object in the room. Media outlets ran the image on front pages across the continent, the empty chair that spoke loudest. Burkina Faso's silence echoes across summit. Who fills the seat? And on whose terms? The message had landed, and it wasn't just about language, it was about loyalty. For decades, summits like these were built around polished partnerships, whispered funding pledges, and unspoken promises to preserve the status quo. Traoré's refusal to attend without structural honesty challenged the very foundation of those gatherings. That night, Burkina Faso's national radio aired a segment in 5 local languages. A child read Traoré's statement, followed by elders offering reflections. One old man said, "He didn't leave the room, he waited until the room became worthy of us." Across the country, murals appeared, not of war, not of resistance, but of the empty seat. One painting in Ouagadougou showed a wooden chair with wildflowers growing through it. The caption underneath read, "Let truth take the seat next." In response, summit organizers sent a formal letter to Ouagadougou, asking for a bilateral discussion on Traoré's concerns. His office returned it unopened, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity, because the question was no longer, will Burkina Faso return to the table? It was, what kind of table is worth returning to? And until that answer changed, the seat would remain exactly as it was, unfilled, unbending, unapologetic, and impossibly powerful. It happened quietly, just after sunrise. There were no speeches, no announcements, no marching bands, just a slow procession of maintenance workers and schoolchildren arriving at the gates of the presidential palace with bundles of cloth, rolls of thread, and wooden poles tied with twine. The foreign flags that had long lined the grand hallway, symbols of old partnerships, past aid packages, and forgotten promises, were being taken down one by one. The French tricolour, the EU emblem, the tall blue of the World Bank, gone, folded respectfully, not burned, not torn, but removed. In their place came new ones, not from other countries, but from within. Hand-sewn village flags, some with suns, some with cattle, some with rivers, some with millet stalks. Each one represented a community that had survived despite neglect. Flags made by elders, dyed with local soil, carried to the capital on the backs of donkeys and inside rice sacks. The guards at the palace gate didn't stop them. They helped. President Traoré arrived just as the last foreign flag was lowered. He didn't wear his uniform, just a simple shirt and sandals, dust still on the cuffs from his visit to a farming cooperative that morning. He walked the length of the corridor, hand brushing against each new flag. Names were embroidered in the corners: Diapaga, Sinindu, Arbinda, Dori. Places politicians rarely visited, places where truth had always outlived policy. A little girl, no more than 7, stood by her village's flag, a piece of linen with 3 green stars stitched in a crooked line. She looked up at Traoré, holding his hand tightly. "Where is the old flag?" she asked. Traoré knelt down beside her, his voice soft. "In our hearts," he said, "but not on our contracts anymore." She nodded slowly, though she didn't fully understand, but he wasn't speaking to her alone. He was speaking to a nation. By midday, the word had spread far beyond the palace gates. Vendors near the palace began selling small, hand-stitched replicas of the village flags instead of imported ones. A tailor in Bobo de Lasso reported over 50 orders in a single afternoon. Schools started planning lessons around the history of their own communities. Not colonial maps, but the rivers, hills, and harvest stories passed down through families. News agencies around the world scrambled to respond. Some headlines were diplomatic. Burkina Faso embraces cultural identity in palace redesign. Others were sharper. Traoré removes international flags amid rising tensions. But none of them truly understood what had happened that morning. Because this wasn't rejection, it was reclamation. For decades, the palace had been a gallery of allegiance. Each foreign flag planted there had come with conditions: loans, military advisors, resource rights, and fine print written in foreign languages. Traoré's decision didn't erase those memories. It ended their dominance. At a press conference the next day, a reporter from a major international outlet asked the question directly. "Mr. President, what message are you sending by removing the flags of your international partners?" He didn't hesitate. "We didn't remove partners," he said. "We removed shadows." He pointed to a photo behind him. An image of villagers raising their new flag in front of a school rebuilt entirely with local funds. "From now on, every contract we sign must reflect the people on that wall, not the signatures in someone else's office." That evening, he hosted no dinner gala, no diplomatic reception. Instead, he invited 200 children from across the country to tour the palace. They touched the walls, walked barefoot on the cool tile, and played with wooden puzzles shaped like their provinces. One boy pointed to a room and asked, "Who used to sit here?" Traoré replied softly, "Someone who forgot you were out there." The boy frowned in confusion. "But you remember, right?" Traoré smiled. "I do now." Outside, the old flagpoles stood shorter, but they carried more weight than ever. As night fell, the village flags caught the breeze. Not just fabric waving, but proof that something had shifted in the capital, in the country, and in the quiet spaces where identity had once waited to be seen. That day, the hall didn't just get new flags. It got its memory back. There was no farewell parade, no staged military ceremony, no red carpet exit from the presidential palace. When Ibrahim Traoré retired, he did it the same way he had governed. Quietly, intentionally, with his eyes fixed on the people, not the camera. The official announcement came in a short press release. President Ibrahim Traoré will step down at the conclusion of this term. He will not seek re-election. No fanfare, no elaboration. But across Burkina Faso, the people understood exactly what it meant. He had done what most leaders promise and few complete. He came to clean, and when the work was finished, he left. Weeks later, a new exhibit opened at the National Museum of Integrity, built in the former headquarters of the disbanded Anti-Corruption Court. The exhibit was modest, no golden statues, no giant portraits, just artifacts from Traoré's presidency, a worn pair of boots, his handwritten speeches, the ledger from Segway's cooperative mine, and the first village flag ever raised inside the palace. At the center of the room stood a single glass frame. It was one page, no letterhead, no signature, just ink on paper. We didn't cleanse a cabinet. We cleansed our conscience. And we never served powers. We served people. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Written on his final night in office, left without announcement, discovered by a museum volunteer who thought it was trash." That framed page became one of the most photographed objects in the country. School children visited it every week. Civics teachers began using it as a writing prompt. What would you leave behind if no one could see you do it? One morning, a group of fifth graders stood in front of the frame. A girl read the words aloud, her voice soft but steady. Others nodded. One boy whispered, "My father used to mop the floor under this room. Now he teaches accounting." Outside the museum, construction crews worked under the sun. Just across the road, the new Parliament chamber was rising, steel beams climbing skyward brick by brick. Half of the workers were volunteers. The other half were paid from a national fund created entirely from seized corruption assets. There were no foreign contractors. The project had no foreign loans. Every cement bag, every pipe, every brick came from local providers. It wasn't just a building, it was proof. Proof that honesty could build what lies only planned. One of the foremen, a man who had once been a mining laborer under a foreign firm, now supervised 20 workers and trained apprentices. "We used to dig under someone else's flag," he said. "Now we raise walls under our own." Inside the new chamber, the floor was already laid. It wasn't marble. It was carved wood from regional forests, each panel engraved with the name of a province. Each row aligned to face the speaker's desk. That desk hadn't arrived yet. It was still being crafted by a carpenter in Benora, who had once worked as a street vendor. He had won the commission through a national competition judged by students, not politicians. The design was simple but radical, a table with no back wall, so the person leading would always face the country, not just the elite. In his final public appearance before retirement, Traoré stood at the edge of the construction site, surrounded by workers and students. He wasn't introduced by title, just by name. He didn't give a long speech, just one line, "Don't carve my name into stone, build your own." Then he stepped aside. His final day in office came and went like any other, no parades, no promises. Just one man walking away from power while the country kept building without him. Weeks later, a journalist asked a boy in Sianaga what he thought of the retired president. The boy shrugged and said, "He didn't stay forever." The journalist asked why that mattered, because it means he trusted us to keep going. And they did. The final camera shot in the national broadcast wasn't of Traoré, it was of the parliament roof being lifted into place. A drone pulled back slowly, revealing the entire structure glowing in the sunset light. Beneath the image, the closing narration played in every dialect. He did not reign, he repaired. And the country, long broken by silence and fear, finally stood whole. The museum kept the framed note in its center hall. Tour guides would stop there last, so visitors left carrying the words in their minds. In village markets, elders told stories of a leader who left the chair empty so others could fill it. In schools, children learned that courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just refusing to look away. And across Africa, the name Traoré became a quiet synonym for something rare, a leader who kept his word. From Cape Town to Dakar, from Addis Ababa to Lagos, voices began to rise. If Burkina Faso can stand, so can we. Because this was never just about one man. It was about a continent remembering its own worth. Now let's talk. Do you believe Africa can truly shape its own future without relying on foreign powers? Or do partnerships remain necessary? If a leader like Traoré emerged in your home country, would you trust them immediately? Or would you wait to see if they prove themselves first? What does serving the people truly look like in today's Africa? And is it the same as when you were young? Should leaders step down after completing their goals, even if the people want them to stay? Your perspectives matter. Your memories matter. Share your thoughts, your debates, and even your disagreements, because a conversation across generations is how history moves forward. If you believe in Africa rising and in the vision of Traoré, write the phrase Africa Rise in the comments. Like this video, share it with your friends and community, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of courage from our continent. In our next episode, we will take you inside another African nation facing its own fight for sovereignty and explore the surprising lessons they are learning from Burkina Faso's journey. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for believing. Until next time.